Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into something completely fascinating. We're exploring the real-life historical dramas, the personal heartbreaks, and the hidden messages baked right into the Tokyo Metropolitan Symphony Orchestra's November 2019 concert repertoire. We're going to go way beyond just the notes on the page to uncover the living, breathing human stories behind these absolute masterpieces. We'll be decoding the scores and examining the wild history that shaped them. Okay, let's dive right into this. I want you to ask yourself, can a symphony actually start a revolution? Or maybe hide a dangerous secret? You know, it's pretty easy to forget today, but for centuries, classical music was not just beautiful sound. It was a potent, powerful tool for political survival. It was a vehicle for defiance and a deeply intimate diary for personal expression. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll be exploring nature, fate, and Beethoven, homesickness in the New World, tales of tragic love, surviving the Soviet regime, and finally, the maestros behind the music.
All right, Section 1, Nature, Fate, and Beethoven.
So, picture the scene. It's December 22nd, 1808, right in the middle of Vienna. You're sitting in a freezing cold theater enduring this epic marathon of a concert. But on that exact same night, Beethoven premiered not one, but two of his greatest masterpieces. He dropped his fateful Symphony No. 5 and his vividly descriptive Symphony No. 6, the Pastoral. They are basically two completely different sides of the exact same genius. Now, with the Pastoral Symphony, he actually breaks the traditional four-movement mold. He expands it into 5 continuous movements to literally paint a picture of a countryside gathering. We hear a gentle brook, a boisterous peasant dance, and then, out of nowhere, it's interrupted by this violent crashing thunderstorm, where he just unleashes the timpani and trombones. Once the storm clears, we get a beautiful shepherd's song of thanks. It was an absolutely revolutionary approach to program music. Now, what's really interesting about this is how people actually reacted back then. When the composer Hector Berlioz heard the companion piece to the Pastoral, Beethoven's triumphant Fifth Symphony, his reaction was just entirely visceral. He was so overwhelmed by its intense, triumphant energy, that famous darkness to light journey, that he said it excited him so much his head was reeling. He literally exclaimed, "One should not be permitted to write such music." I mean, that is how shockingly powerful this piece was to audiences of a time. It wasn't just background entertainment. It was a physical, emotional experience. Moving on to Section 2, Homesickness in the New World. Flash forward a bit to 1892, the legendary Bohemian composer Antonin Dvorak crosses the Atlantic. He accepted an invitation to direct the National Conservatory of Music in New York. And why did he go? Well, his incredibly persuasive sponsor, Jeanette Thurber, offered him a massive salary bump. We're talking roughly 25 times what he was making in Prague. He was treated like a total superstar over there. But, all that money couldn't buy him what he really wanted. On paper, his Symphony No. 9 from the New World was heavily American. He studied African-American spirituals, Native American melodies, and was deeply inspired by Longfellow's epic poem, The Song of Hiawatha. Yet the final result was profoundly nostalgic. It was a deeply bohemian expression. That famous Largo second movement, it's ultimately just a heartbreaking outpouring of his intense homesickness for the wide expanses of the South Bohemian countryside. He was essentially writing a letter back home through his music. That brings us to Section 3, Tales of Tragic Love. So from longing for home, we transition into the absolutely turbulent, devastating emotional world of Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky. For Tchaikovsky, forbidden love, unfulfilled passion, and the cruel hand of fate weren't just abstract ideas. They were constant driving themes in both his personal life and his compositions. He masterfully translated classic literature into pure musical emotion. Take Francesca da Rimini, for example. It's based on Dante's Inferno, depicting doomed lovers who are murdered and condemned to the second circle of hell. Tchaikovsky uses these swirling, discordant strings to actually mimic the dark, howling winds of eternal torment. And then there's his Romeo and Juliet fantasy overture. This was definitely not a quick write. It was an agonizing process. From its first version in 1869, he revised it over the course of more than 10 years, just to perfectly capture the vicious, clashing musical feud between the Capulets and Montagues, and the celestial purity of the young lovers completely crushed by fate. Next up, Section 4, Surviving the Soviet Regime. Now, in mid-20th century Soviet Russia, making music was literally a matter of life and death. The composer Dmitri Shostakovich had to carefully and constantly navigate the incredibly dangerous political dictates of socialist realism under Joseph Stalin. If your music was deemed too complex or formalist, you weren't just fired, your very life and freedom were at risk. So how on earth did an artist survive while keeping their soul intact? Well, Shostakovich brilliantly utilized the DSCH motif. Using the German spelling of his initials, he took the notes D, E flat, C, and B, and secretly encoded his own identity directly into his music. He boldly embedded this musical signature right into his Violin Concerto No. 1. But because the work was so deeply personal and introspective, which the state absolutely hated, he actually had to hide the finished manuscript in a drawer in 1948. He waited a full 7 years, until after Stalin died, to finally premiere it. And this brilliantly illustrates how this double life extended right into his symphonies as well. He would use historically approved Soviet titles to appease the government. For instance, Symphony No. 11 was subtitled The Year 1905, referencing the tragic Bloody Sunday Massacre. Symphony No. 12 was The Year 1917, dedicated to the Bolshevik Revolution. But scholars point out that underneath these neutral historical covers, Shostakovich was potentially hiding subversive critiques of contemporary events. A great example of this is the brutal, terrifying musical depiction of state violence in the 11th Symphony. It was composed right around the time of the 1956 Hungarian uprising, where Soviet troops violently crushed civilian protests. The government censors, they were perfectly happy. But the people listening, they understood the real message. Finally, Section 5, the maestros behind the music. So bringing this incredible historical repertoire into the present day are the dedicated artists of the Tokyo Metropolitan Symphony Orchestra. First up, we have conductor Naoto Otomo. He is a phenomenal talent who actually made his professional debut conducting the NHK Symphony Orchestra when he was just 22 years old. For this specific concert series, he was at the helm to direct the performance of Dvorak's emotionally charged New World Symphony. And bridging the gap between that history and today, we can look at this historic album cover. That's Dmitri Shostakovich on the left, his son Maxim in the back, and the legendary violinist David Oistrakh on the right. Oistrakh was the actual dedicatee of that hidden Violin Concerto No. 1 we talked about, and he's the very man who premiered it once it was finally safe to do so. In the TMSO series, this monumental, deeply personal work was brought to life by the brilliant Czech violinist Josef Spacek under the baton of Eliyahu Imbal. They are continuing this amazing lineage of defiance and artistry. Because really, behind every majestic chord, every soaring violin melody, and every thunderous strike of the timpani, there are real people. People battling fate, longing for home, seeking love, and sometimes just fighting to survive. Next time you hear an orchestra play, what hidden histories are you going to be listening for? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep listening closely, and I'll catch you next time.